Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist, Isabel Oakeshott. So good to see you both. Good evening to you two.
Evening.
So to those front pages then, and Downing Street is working on the assumption that the second wave of COVID-19 will be more deadly than the first. That's according to the Daily Telegraph. Calls for a second national lockdown leads The Guardian as the UK records 60,000 deaths. The opposite story on the front of the Eye, with pressure building on the government to set out a roadmap out of lockdown, particularly for regional areas. The Financial Times reports two of the biggest banks, HSBC and Santander, declare the worst of the economic damage from COVID is behind them. A similar story on the front of The Guardian, with calls for a second national lockdown as the UK records 60,000 deaths. Tragedy in the Channel leads the Daily Mail following the deaths of two children and two adults who lost their lives in rough waters attempting to reach the UK. So Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott here with me to go through some of those front pages. And Sonia, you've picked out the Daily Telegraph first of all, but a number of the front pages go on the very high daily coronavirus death figures for the UK that came out today. And their headline says that the second wave forecast to be more deadly than the first.
That's right. So the tragic number of figures of deaths that we've seen today, it's the highest that we've seen in the UK since late May, 369. We've got a situation where in Leeds, the NHS Trust in Leeds, is talking about how overwhelmed they're getting with patients presenting with severe COVID that needs to be treated. And this is a really worrying story, I think, because it suggests that the evidence that's being put in front of the Prime Minister is that, we know that the mortality rate isn't quite as high as in the first wave, which is really good news. And that's because treatments are getting better. But people are still presenting to hospitals with very serious symptoms. And the evidence that is being put in front of the Prime Minister seems to suggest that although the death rate is not climbing as quickly, thank goodness, as it was in the first wave, actually it could be a longer peak. So we could see more deaths in the second wave potentially. And this is on the basis of modelling that SAGE has done. We know that SAGE relies on a few different models and it looks at the results of a few different models. It sort of puts them all together to try and come up with the best estimate. Obviously, models aren't sort of firm predictions. They're just modelling different scenarios. But I think it is really, really worrying in light of the figures that we're seeing out today. And that's why a lot of the newspaper front pages are focusing on, well, what does this mean for us as a country? What strategy should we take? Are the measures that we've got in place going far enough to keep this under control? Because the awful thing is that once people start presenting with really acute symptoms, that starts to crowd out other things from the NHS, which is obviously a situation that needs to be avoided at all costs.
Well, yes, and we'll talk about some of those front pages that deal with the potential next strategy in a moment. But Isabel, first of all, your reaction to this headline and also the daily figures, because last month, Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientific advisor, warned that deaths could go up to as many as 200 a day in November. He warned that last month. Today's daily total of 367 obviously surpasses that. Some thought that prediction at the time was implausible. So what do you make of the Telegraph's take on this?
Well, I think that clearly no one wants to see figures like this. They are serious numbers, but you've got to keep them in some context. And I think many people don't realise how many people a day die anyway. So on any average day, 1,600 people die. So that gives you some idea of where these figures fit into that context. And remember that the average survival rate for coronavirus is 99.5%. So whilst every corona death is a tragedy, the vast majority of these fatalities are within patients who are over the age of 80. So already they will be 82 generally on average, so well over average life expectancy. So that's not to be dismissive at all about the scale of the challenge that we have on our hands, but it's really important to keep this in perspective and not get too sort of alarmist about it. And, absolutely, it's right that the NHS can't be allowed to become overwhelmed, but the NHS is nowhere near that stage at the moment. The number of people who are in hospital with coronavirus-associated conditions is only about 1/10 of NHS hospital beds in England at the moment.
And yet, so just very briefly, Isabel, as Sonia was saying, hospitals in Leeds are saying only essential surgery will go ahead after the number of coronavirus patients there being treated is now more than at the peak of pandemic in April. So does that worry you?
Well, the entire impact on the NHS worries me, and the extent to which it's kind of shut up shop in many areas. And that's not necessarily the fault of the NHS and all the people who are working very hard there, but the impact of this pandemic of fear that has been spread through the population, so that you actually have cancer doctors saying that their patients aren't coming in to get routine treatment. You have people failing to get symptoms checked out. It's extremely hard to get a face-to-face GP appointment. So I think that the health problems that we're storing up, the non-coronavirus health problems that we're storing up, are literally going to take years to deal with. The backlog of operations and surgeries is going to be unbelievably serious. It will be in the millions of cases that need to be dealt with. So we have to keep the reaction to this proportionate.
OK, and so let's talk about the reaction, because Sonia, as you said, that some of the front pages, including The Guardian, look at what should happen next. They're saying calls for national lockdown grows as the UK death toll exceeds 60,000.
Yes, that's right. So The Guardian is linking this to the calls that we've seen for a national circuit breaker that we've seen happen in Wales, in Northern Ireland. This would be a short, time-limited lockdown with the aim of bringing the number of cases down. And that's really in light of evidence. There's some evidence that the extra level of restrictions in Tier 3 have had some impact on bringing the number of cases down in Liverpool, but there's not much evidence that general Tier 2 restrictions are working and restricting the increase in the infection rate across the country. And you've got a lot of scientists saying that. I think it is just really important to go back to that point that Isabel was making there about keeping the response proportionate. I mean, unfortunately, I think in the middle of a global pandemic, there is no such thing as a sort of moderate or modest response. Because if you don't react in the here and now to rising infection rates, and you don't try and keep a lid on them through social restrictions, and no one wants social restrictions, they're a measure of last resort. Unfortunately, we're in a position where we need them because the government totally bungled its test and trace scheme over the summer, and that's not working very well now. But the problem is if you don't put in place restrictions, the NHS gets overwhelmed, and it's not a question of a proportionate response. Once there are lots and lots of patients presenting with very serious acute symptoms that require hospitalisation, that require critical care beds, I mean, you can't turn people away, and it does mean that elective care gets cancelled. So I agree with Isabel that in a global pandemic, it creates a massive backlog for the NHS. But there's no alternative to trying to keep a lid on this and prevent people from ending up in hospital in the first place.
Isabel?
Well, of course there's an alternative, and that is protecting the people that need to be protected most and letting others get on with it. And I don't think the response has been uniformly proportionate. And in a lot of cases, we are doing far more than is necessary to keep people safe at immense cost to livelihoods and other wider health. So I'm sorry, I just don't agree with that. No one wants to see lives lost unnecessarily, but the wider cost of this, and I don't just mean to the economy, is horrendous.
OK, and this debate, I know we could continue for a long time, but we do need to take a break now. We're going to return in just a moment, though, with lots more to talk about, including a tragedy in the Channel after 2 children and 2 adults lose their lives trying to get to the UK. We'll be talking about that in just a moment. Welcome back. You're watching The Press Preview. With me tonight, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist, Isabel Oakeshott. And Isabel, we're turning to the front of the Daily Mail to kick off this section. And their headline, their very stark headline, Tragedy in the Channel, reflecting the terrible news that 4 people have died trying to cross the Channel, including 2 children aged 5 and 8 today.
Yes, so a really tragic situation there where, I mean, perhaps not surprisingly, given the number of migrants trying to come over the Channel in often very, very inadequate vessels, there has now been a significant loss of life. And I think that many voters will be absolutely infuriated by this. They will be struck by the human tragedy of it, but they'll also be infuriated both with our own government and the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who has utterly failed so far to get a grip on this problem. It's not like it's a new situation here. Literally thousands of migrants have attempted to make this journey this year alone. And I think there will also be a very significant degree of anger towards the French, who on their side are really clearly not doing enough to stop people setting off on these desperately dangerous missions.
Sonia, what do you make of it?
So it's really clear what's at the root of the problem of this. It's the fact that the government have closed down safe routes for asylum seekers to come to the UK. These people who tragically lost their lives were Iraqi Kurds. They will be fleeing desperate circumstances and very likely to be real exploitation in Iraq.
Those desperate circumstances.
If I could just finish my point, we know that numbers claiming asylum in the UK, they are not high, as Isabel implied with her numbers there. They're actually far lower than they were in the mid-2000s. They're lower than they were in 2016. The reason why we're seeing people tragically trying to make this crossing is that during the pandemic, other routes to come into the UK have closed. The government has shut down its resettlement schemes, I think quite disgracefully, and not replaced them with anything. So as charities like Save the Children are arguing here, if you want to stop people making this desperate, dangerous journey, many of whom who have escaped awful torture, exploitation and abuse, what you have to do is you have to give them safe routes to come to the UK and claim asylum. So that's what it's very, very important to do.
Isabel?
No, I just think that's absolutely ridiculous. Clearly, if you gave people safe routes, we'd have a multiple of the number of people that are coming over. And exactly what torture are any of these people facing in France? I'm bewildered by this. Is there some kind of despotic regime that I've not heard about in France? Because that's where they're coming from.
We're a signatory to international law, which says that people have a legal right to claim asylum if they reach a country's shores. And there are asylum seekers who would prefer to come to the UK than other countries because they speak English or because they may have family members here. And I think, actually, if you're fleeing a war zone, it's okay to have a preference for which country you might go to if you speak the language, for example. And it's just not true to imply that we're flooded by asylum seekers. The UK has way less claims for asylum than France and Germany. We do not pull our weight compared to some other European countries. So this idea that the UK is sort of flooded by asylum seekers fleeing torture and desperate circumstances just doesn't stack up in the figures. It's scaremongering by people who want us to sort of be scared about this.
We have to leave it there. It's another debate that could go on and on. We will get a chance to revisit some of these issues at 11:30. You're both going to be back then. But for the moment, I'm going to call time on it. And Sonia and Isabel, good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed.